The only real difference between him and Basil is that he was small and had a very large henpecking wife.
So I didn't have any problems with saying what I didn't think was funny. No, I don't believe that. Why does he say that?
There are television moments so explosive, so audacious, that they don't just make audiences laugh, they make entire broadcasting networks sweat. And then there are moments that manage to do something rarer still. They become the very reason a beloved show disappears from screens altogether. Fawlty Towers, the magnificent, manic, 12-episode wonder that John Cleese unleashed on British television in 1975, was never a show that played it safe. But somewhere between the slapstick and the satire, one particular moment crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. To truly understand how a comedy so brilliant could be brought down by a single scene, you have to go back to where it all began, back to a real hotel in a sleepy seaside town, and a real man so spectacularly terrible at his job that he accidentally became a legend. The year was 1970, and the Monty Python team had gathered in Torquay, a coastal resort town in Devon, to film episodes of their groundbreaking sketch show. Like any traveling creative team, they needed somewhere to sleep, and they checked into the Gleneagles Hotel, expecting nothing more than a bed and a decent breakfast. What they got instead was something far more extraordinary, and far more infuriating. The hotel was managed by a man named Donald Sinclair, and from the moment guests walked through his doors, they understood they had entered a very particular kind of madness. Sinclair was not merely rude in the way that overworked hospitality staff sometimes are. He was rude with a kind of theatrical dedication that suggested he had studied rudeness as an art form and perfected it over decades. He regarded his guests with open suspicion, as though every arriving traveler was probably a criminal or at least someone with deeply questionable intentions. He corrected table manners. He questioned motivations. He created an atmosphere so unwelcoming that staying at his hotel felt less like a holiday and more like appearing before a particularly uncharitable magistrate. One incident, in particular, became legendary among the Python team. When Eric Idle left his briefcase unattended in the lobby for a few moments, Sinclair didn't page the owner, didn't set it aside, didn't handle it with any of the calm professionalism you might hope for. Instead, convinced the bag was a bomb, he threw it over the garden wall. No conversation, no assessment, just immediate, theatrical action followed by the serene confidence of a man who believed he had done exactly the right thing. John Cleese watched all of this with the wide, fascinated eyes of a comedian who has just stumbled across an unmissable gift. Where other guests felt frustrated or bewildered, Cleese felt inspired. He began to mentally catalogue everything. The contempt, the arrogance, the spectacular gap between how Sinclair perceived himself and how he actually performed his job. Here was a man who genuinely believed he was running a refined establishment while single-handedly destroying any chance of that being true. The tragedy and the comedy were inseparable. Cleese took notes. Years later, those notes would become Basil Fawlty. When Cleese sat down with his then-wife, actress and writer Connie Booth, to develop what would become Fawlty Towers, they weren't simply recreating Donald Sinclair. They were distilling something universal about a very particular kind of human failure. The failure of a man who desperately wants to be admired and consistently does everything possible to ensure that he won't be. Basil Fawlty was Sinclair's chaos amplified and refined, filtered through Cleese's instinct for farce and Booth's sharp understanding of character dynamics. The show premiered on the BBC in September 1975, and the initial critical response was, to put it charitably, mixed. At least one critic dismissed the first episode as a disaster, a word that, with hindsight, reads as deeply ironic given that disaster was always precisely the point. But while critics scratched their heads, audiences understood immediately. They recognized Basil's particular brand of tortured ambition, his desperate social striving, his explosive reactions to situations he almost always made worse himself. The show was built on a brilliant and very human paradox. The more furiously Basil tried to maintain control, the more spectacularly everything fell apart around him. The supporting cast was no less essential to the alchemy. Prunella Scales played Sybil Fawlty with the kind of precise, knowing authority that could puncture Basil's every delusion with a single withering glance or the well-timed pronunciation of his name. Connie Booth's Polly, the hotel's sharp and sensible maid, served as the nearest thing the show had to a voice of reason, a role that became increasingly desperate as the episodes progressed. And then there was Manuel, the eager, bewildered, perpetually unfortunate Spanish waiter played by Andrew Sachs, whose combination of genuine warmth and spectacular miscommunication turned every crisis into something even more magnificently unmanageable. Together, these four characters created a small, sealed world of escalating catastrophe that felt absolutely real precisely because its emotional logic was so truthfully observed. The BBC's faith in the show wobbled after the first 6 episodes aired. Viewing figures were respectable but not overwhelming, and there were genuine internal discussions about whether a second series made commercial sense. What changed the calculation was the rerun. As the episodes were broadcast again, audiences grew, conversations spread, and it became clear that Fawlty Towers had built something rare, a devoted following that didn't just watch the show but quoted it, dissected it, and returned to it repeatedly. A second series was commissioned, and it aired in 1979, 4 years after the first. 12 episodes in total, and then nothing. Cleese and Booth had said everything they wanted to say. The hotel closed its doors. Of all 12 episodes, one stands so far above the rest in terms of cultural impact and controversy that it has become virtually synonymous with the show itself. The Germans, broadcast in October 1975 as the 6th episode of the first series, is simultaneously celebrated as a work of comic genius and condemned as one of British television's most contentious half-hours. Understanding why requires understanding exactly what happens in it, and more importantly, understanding what Cleese and Booth were actually trying to do. The episode begins with Basil having sustained a head injury. A moose head falls on him during its installation in the hotel lobby, and he spends much of the episode operating under the effects of what is clearly a concussion, though nobody seems particularly concerned about this. When a party of German tourists arrives to check in, Basil becomes almost paralyzed with the effort of not saying anything that might reference the Second World War. He issues his now legendary instruction to his staff, "Don't mention the war," with all the doomed certainty of a man who has already lost the battle he's trying to avoid. What follows is one of the most technically accomplished pieces of escalating farce in the history of television comedy. Despite his furious determination to maintain decorum, Basil mentions the war almost immediately. And then again. And then again. Each reference drags him further into a spiral of mortification and overcorrection, until finally, in a moment of complete comedic breakdown, he launches into a full impression of Adolf Hitler, complete with exaggerated goose step, in the middle of his own hotel lobby. The scene drew immediate and ferocious reaction. Letters arrived at the BBC in considerable numbers. Critics accused the show of trivializing history, of making entertainment out of genuine horror, of reducing one of the darkest chapters in human experience to a punchline. Some called for the episode to be permanently shelved. BBC executives held serious internal discussions about whether the corporation had made an error of editorial judgment in broadcasting the episode at all. In the end, the episode remained, but not before extensive and heated debate about where the line between satire and offense was located, and whether Fawlty Towers had crossed it. The crucial question at the heart of the controversy, then and now, is the one that Cleese himself has addressed repeatedly and with characteristic directness. Who is the target of the joke? Because in comedy, the answer to that question is the difference between satire and cruelty, between insight and offense. In The Germans, the answer is unambiguous, if you're paying attention. The German tourists are not the butt of the humor. They are, by the standards of the episode, largely dignified, reasonable people who happen to be staying at an incompetently managed hotel. They are not mocked for being German. They are not presented as villains or caricatures. The joke, from beginning to end, is about Basil, about his obsession with the war, his inability to stop thinking about it, his absolute certainty that he can suppress his own fixation through willpower alone. The comedy comes from his failure to manage himself, not from anything the German guests do or represent. What Cleese was actually satirizing was something very specific to British culture of the 1970s. A collective inability to let the war recede into history, a tendency to define national identity in relation to a conflict that had ended 30 years earlier. A peculiar psychological condition in which the memory of wartime was simultaneously a source of pride and an obsession that prevented genuine engagement with the present. Basil was not a spokesperson for this tendency. He was its victim, and the audience was meant to be laughing at him, not with him. The goose step was not a tribute to fascism. It was a portrait of a man so trapped in his own neuroses that he had lost all capacity for normal human interaction. This distinction matters enormously, and the failure to recognize it is what drove much of the controversy. Critics who called the episode offensive were, in a sense, making exactly the mistake Basil made. They were responding to the surface content without engaging with the structure of the joke. Cleese, who has never been shy about defending his work, made this argument forcefully in the years that followed, and he was right to do so. But being right doesn't always prevent a television program from being pulled off the air. Decades passed, and The Germans settled into its place as one of the most famous episodes of one of the most famous sitcoms ever made. The phrase "don't mention the war" entered the permanent vocabulary of British popular culture, deployed in countless contexts, always understood. The episode was studied in media courses, referenced in academic discussions of comedy and satire, and revisited by successive generations of viewers who found it just as sharp and funny as audiences had in 1975. And then streaming arrived, and with streaming came a new kind of scrutiny. In the early 2020s, as cultural conversations about representation, historical sensitivity, and the responsibilities of entertainment platforms intensified, Fawlty Towers found itself caught in a wave of re-examination. Several streaming services chose to remove The Germans entirely from their catalogues. Others broadcast edited versions with specific moments cut. The decision sparked immediate and fierce reaction from fans, critics, and from Cleese himself. The argument against these edits was essentially the same argument Cleese had always made about the episode. Removing or altering it demonstrated a fundamental misreading of what the comedy was doing. To cut the Hitler impression from the Germans is not to protect anyone from offense, it is to strip out the evidence that Basil is behaving ridiculously. Without the full context of his breakdown, the episode becomes less clear, not more. The satire depends on the excess. Pull the thread, and the whole thing unravels. But the argument for editing, or removal, rested on a different premise entirely. That the impact of media content cannot be fully controlled by authorial intention, that audiences bring their own histories and experiences to what they watch, and that a scene involving a Hitler impression, regardless of its satirical intent, can cause genuine distress to people for whom that imagery carries very real and personal pain. This is not an